Okay, in this tutorial I'm going to go through what a mutation is. So we've looked at alleles, and mutations aren't really that different. A mutation is when there is a change to the genetic sequence. So a mutation, for instance, if this might be the original sequence, A, C, T, G, T, C, A, T, 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 A, C, G, T, and over here, A, C, G, A, alright? So these T's maybe have been changed to A's. So mutation is when there's a change to the genetic sequence, to our DNA. And that change, if it occurs within a gene, especially, can affect our function or our characteristics. Now, an allele, different versions of a gene, actually come about through mutation. So sometimes changing the sequence of a gene will just give us a slightly different characteristics. So, for instance, blue eyes and green eyes are all actually mutations of the brown eye allele. We think the brown color was the original color, and a mutation, a slight change to that sequence, gave us the green and the blue and those colors. So a mutation is when a change occurs to the sequence. So alleles, different versions of a gene, are actually mutants. They're actually versions that have come about through a mutation from some original ancestral kind of version of the gene. So brown is the normal. So unless you've got brown eyes, you're a mutant. All right. So that gene, someone in your family tree, in your history, had a brown eye gene, which was mutated, which changed in sequence slightly to give the green or the blue eye allele. So a mutation, and we'll write that down in a minute, is any change to the DNA sequence of an organism. So any change. Sometimes some people or some textbooks will include any permanent change to the DNA. Okay, so the DNA of an organism. Now, what can happen though is it's actually in a lot of cases, if the mutation occurs within a gene or affects in a gene, it may not simply give us a slightly different version. The gene might not work at all. So this gene here, the sequence, might give us our normal functioning protein, which gives us our normal characteristic, like eye color or the ability to roll our tongue or something like that. And this mutant version of the gene, with the A's here instead of the T's, might give us a non-functioning protein. And that will give us some sort of loss of function or make us lose some characteristic. So a mutation occurs when you change the sequence of the DNA, and we might lose, in that case, we might have a non-functional protein. The mutation may simply produce a new allele. It might just give us a slightly different version, a slightly new allele. And in fact, most of us have some mutations in us that actually have very little effect, because it just produces a new allele, or maybe even though the sequence is slightly different, it might even still code for a protein that basically functions exactly like the original one, and so there's no noticeable difference. But a mutation is this: a change, a permanent change to the sequence of an organism's DNA. And it can result, if it affects a gene and the gene codes for a protein that no longer functions, it can result in a loss of function or characteristic. It can be quite detrimental. So for instance, cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a disorder that primarily affects the lungs. Now, I have a close friend who's actually was an ex-student who had cystic fibrosis, someone I've visited in hospital many times, who suffered from cystic fibrosis, and it is really quite a severe condition. So cystic fibrosis occurs when a gene for the CFTR gene, now that stands for cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator gene, bit of a mouthful, you don't need to know that at all, but the cystic fibrosis gene, the normal version of this gene, is involved in the transport of ions. Now, if you've done some chemistry, you know what ions are, particularly chloride ions, so Cl- ions, across membranes. And basically, that affects the water balance, or the transport of water across membranes. Now, if you are unfortunate enough to get a stuffed up version of this gene, now the most commonly inherited stuffed up version of this gene, for some reason, is basically these three letters here, this AAA, these three letters here are basically lost. They're deleted. Now there's no gap, it just carries on here, TAGCC, okay? It just, these people are missing the three A's here. That's the most common cause of this condition. So for some reason a mutation, maybe an error occurs while our DNA is being copied, and it skips or leaves out those three A's and goes on to the next letters. So someone who has cystic fibrosis has basically lost these three. And that means the CFTR protein isn't produced, and they can't transport those ions properly. And they end up with really thick, sticky mucus because it doesn't have enough water, enough liquid in it. And that thick, sticky mucus means that the lung can't clear out that mucus. Normally, you're clearing out mucus from your lungs all the time. You have tiny little hairs on the cells of your lung cells that beat up the mucus, and when it gets to the top of the throat, you actually swallow it and it goes down into the stomach, where the stomach acid kills any of the bugs, bacteria and dust and things that are in it. Someone who has cystic fibrosis can't clear out that mucus. So one of the treatments is physiotherapy, where they pound on the back of their chest, and that loosens up some of the mucus and they sort of cough that up. But really the problem is because they can't clear out that mucus, often bacteria and things get trapped in the lungs. And so people who suffer from cystic fibrosis often have chronic lung infections. They just keep getting lung infections one after the other, and that really after a while starts to cause damage to the lung. And in fact, most people who have cystic fibrosis, often when they get to their 30s or sometimes even a lot younger, but a lot of people with cystic fibrosis will eventually need a lung transplant, or their lung function deteriorates so much that essentially they can't get enough oxygen. They become very short of breath, and it becomes they need to go on oxygen from a cylinder, but even then eventually the lung basically becomes too damaged. Even after a lung transplant, a lot of people think when you have an organ transplant, it's fixed, you're good. Even after a lung transplant, you end up on immunosuppressants for basically the rest of your life. And a lot of lung transplants aren't a permanent solution. So a lung transplant, to the best of my knowledge, has a lifespan of about 10 years. So if you have a lung transplant, you'll probably live for another 10 years. But I don't know whether that's improved since I last checked, and yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that exact figure. But cystic fibrosis is a condition that affects primarily the lungs. It also affects the digestive system because the mucus is so thick there. The enzymes don't really get into the food properly. So people with cystic fibrosis take tablets with enzymes in them. Often they have to wake up at ridiculous times in the morning to take some of those tablets. But that just helps them ensure they actually break down their food and actually get some nutrients. So cystic fibrosis is really quite a severe condition and quite a sad one really, and really just caused because usually in most cases because the person is missing these three letters in the gene for this one protein. Now, that's really where genetics is such an amazing field to be in at the moment, because maybe in the future it might be possible to use a virus or something to insert a correct copy of the gene into the person's DNA, and so maybe we'll be able to cure or restore the function. And at the moment, the treatments, none of them are perfect. They all have side effects, and ultimately, there's a limit to how effective they are. Whereas if we could correct the gene so that they had the fully normally functioning gene, essentially we would solve the problem without any side effects or anything. Now, one thing just to be aware of is that basically the normal version of this gene is a big A because it produces the protein that functions. And this stuffed up version of the gene, the one that doesn't have these A's here and makes a protein that doesn't work, is a little a. So what normally happens, and sort of with my friend, her parents are both big A, little a, so they're both what we call carriers. They're carriers because they have a little a hidden, stuffed up version of this gene, the gene that's missing these three A's. So if they are crossed when they have children, so when they had children, some of their children happen to inherit 2 stuffed up versions of the gene, so here 2 little a's, alright, and suddenly that hidden gene was no longer quite so hidden, and so someone with cystic fibrosis has been unfortunate enough to inherit 2 stuffed up versions of the gene, their little a, for this gene. So that's quite unfortunate. And what it means is that for parents who are carriers, who have a big A, little a, they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a kid with cystic fibrosis if both parents are carriers. So that's cystic fibrosis. Basically a loss or a deletion of 3 bases, and if you get 2 stuffed up versions of this gene, then basically you really have some issues with your lung function, and quite a nasty disorder. All right, so let's look at another example. So another example of a mutation is this one here, and this one is Down syndrome. So this is a little bit different. Down syndrome, I should put that up here. I just put mutations. So Down syndrome is actually the result of getting an extra chromosome. So what's happened here, you can see this person has inherited an extra chromosome 21, and that's what causes Down syndrome. Now you may think, well, that's not really, chopping out a few bases or things like that. That doesn't really meet our definition for mutations. Well, actually, it does. It's any change to the DNA sequence of an organism. So even by adding extra DNA, that's still a change to an organism's DNA. So people with Down syndrome carry an extra chromosome 21. Well, doesn't having extra, isn't that a good thing? Well, not necessarily, because all of the genes on chromosome 21, they're going to get extra protein, an extra dose of those genes. And that really means that they have too much of some things in their body, because the amount of genes in our genome is perfectly kind of balanced, or has evolved over a long period of time, that we really do have the right amount of each gene. And adding an extra set of all those genes on chromosome 21 will actually have some detrimental effects. And in fact, if you inherited an extra chromosome number 1 or 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to about 18, those would all be lethal. That means you wouldn't be born, you would have died you wouldn't have developed properly. And why is that? Well, let's look at it. Chromosome 1 is a whole lot bigger than 21. 21 is one of the smallest chromosomes in our genome, and so it's going to have less genes on it. So chromosomes 1, 2, 3, all of those ones, they just have too many genes on there that are affected, and some of those genes, if you get an extra dose of them, an extra dose of what they code for, that protein, it's going to have some detrimental effect during your development, and you won't develop properly and you won't survive even till birth. So the ones that people can survive with is an extra chromosome 21, is Down syndrome, and an extra chromosome 18, I believe, is Patau's or Edwards syndrome, one of the two. There are a couple of other examples of some of these smaller chromosomes where if you inherit an extra one, you can still survive. People with Down syndrome have these very typical facial features. You can see here very typical facial features of someone who has Down syndrome. People with Downs can lead relatively normal lives. However, the biggest thing is probably they suffer from learning difficulties. So they often will find learning things quite difficult, and won't do so well academically, or often need assistance from their parents or people in the community to kind of get by because of their learning difficulties. And that's probably to do with the development of the brain, or some aspect of the functioning of the brain. But they also, slightly characteristic features of the face and even the hands are slightly different, and often a sign of Down syndrome. So Down syndrome here, inheriting an extra chromosome 21, and that affects your gene dosage because they've got an extra copy of every gene that's normally found on chromosome 21. So again, that's a mutation. And lastly, just to finish there, a mutation. You've got to be aware of that definition. A mutation any permanent change to an organism's DNA. Cool, hope you found that helpful, and let's get on with the next one.